Please join me in welcoming Evan Carroll onto stage.
Matadors, Hemingway, that's a lot to live up to. So I'll start small. I'll start when I was probably 8 months ago. I was lying in bed. I was too weak to get up off of bed. I was too weak from chemotherapy, too drunk, and too malnourished. And there I was laying, and I knew that what I had to do, my overriding imperative was that I had to go and urinate. And nothing would function though. I couldn't prop myself up, I couldn't lean over, I couldn't roll over off the couch. And so I just gave up and I let go. And that was 8 months ago. As a little bit of a backstory, I've been an alcoholic since I was 14 years old. And I immediately loved the taste, the feeling of the warmth going down. I loved those sorts of things, but what I loved the most was the feeling that it gave me, this feeling of being connected. I felt like I was connected to people, I felt like I was connected to the earth, I felt like I was just part of everything. And I didn't have that feeling when I wasn't drunk, so I knew that getting this substance in me as much as possible, as often as possible, was going to be my overriding concern. And over the next 30 years or so, I'm 46 now, over the next 30 years, I was in sobriety on and off. I knew that I had trouble, and it caused a lot of trouble for me. I had DUIs, and I had family problems because of it. I got into fights with police officers when I was younger, and all these alcohol-related instances that kept happening. And I realized that if I were going to get anywhere in life, I would have to stop drinking. So I stopped drinking for periods of 4 years. At one point, when I was in the Navy, I stopped drinking for a period of 6 years. When I was getting my bachelor's and getting my master's degree and getting my and going to work at a video game company. And so my drinking wasn't always continuous and it wasn't around the clock, but it was there. It was always there. It was after hours, and it was sometimes between hours, sometimes long lunch breaks, sometimes a little bit in the morning. And so that brings me up to present day. About 3 years ago, this is my main story. I was coming home from a teaching job that I had, and as was my custom, I would usually stop somewhere and get something to eat. And as I was eating, the food got stuck halfway down my throat. And this was a new one. And I thought this has never happened before. I've had some sort of gastritis occasionally and some other problems, but having the food stuck in my throat was maybe push a panic button. And for the first time in years, I went to a doctor. And the doctor's diagnosis, after a few endoscopies and some blood tests and things like that, the consensus was that it was esophageal cancer. And the esophageal cancer has a 18% chance survival rate. And I was utterly in shock, of course. I didn't really know how to respond at the time. I went, the first thing I did though was to go buy a bottle of Drambuie and Amaretto. And since my esophagus was accepting some things, I thought, well, this should be the last. So the doctor also prescribed something called palliative care. And palliative care is a type of care that's administered to cancer patients that diminishes the suffering caused by both the cancer, like the pain and the discomfort, and diminishes the pain and discomfort caused by the treatment itself. And so I was undergoing chemotherapy and I was undergoing radiation at the time. and the radiation and the chemotherapy weren't too bad at the beginning. But the palliative care that they were giving me was a drug called roxicodone. It's a liquid form of oxycodone, which is an opioid, to kill the pain. And another drug called Ativan, which is an anti-anxiety drug, which is another powerful drug in its own right. So I was taking those two drugs largely as prescribed and trying to finish up my teaching year. And after the teaching year was over, it came time for me to get the surgery. And the surgery was kind of based on how far down the tumor had shrunk in this radiation chemo treatment, and it hadn't shrunk down far enough. So they had to take out a big chunk of my esophagus, and they were going to reconstruct it and shift some internal organs around, and everything was going to be okay. I was going to be able to eat normally, and everything was going to be fine, except that a couple weeks afterwards, the entire thing came apart, and I was draining into my pleural cavity. I could hardly breathe. My lungs were collapsing, and I had to go back into the hospital where they removed the entirety of my esophagus, well, most of my esophagus and my stomach. And that left me with a big hole inside my neck where saliva could drain out of, and it left me with a feeding tube. And I was absolutely devastated. I would have to wear some sort of protective garment around my neck and a bag to collect all the fluid. I would have to do all of my feeding, this bland sort of nutritional supplement. I would have to inject this bland sort of supplement into my feeding tube for the rest of my life, I thought. And one miraculous thing that happened, though, was that after that surgery was done, my friends and family gathered around me in an unbelievable show of support. They threw fundraisers for me. They came over and played video games with me. They gave me all kinds of free stuff, free yoga, free graphic novels, free movies, and it was that really kept me aloft during that time, just having their company. And unfortunately, not too long after that surgery, some scans turned up that I had a brain tumor, and the cancer had metastasized into my brain, and I had to be treated with radiation for that, where they created a mask and bolted it down so that I couldn't move, and then they shot beams of radiation into the tumors, and they were successful with that. And they also went in and did an operation. They removed part of my skull, and the tumor came out fairly easily. After that, I went out and into the world. Weirdly enough, I don't know if I can date it back to that exact point. I've never been able to park cars quite correctly. So that's it's one of the downsides of the otherwise successful brain operation. So I'm always at an angle, but I try to work with it. Right after that, I was being prescribed a lot of the medication I had originally, but one thing that I had never told my doctor was that I was an addict and an alcoholic. So I by no means, when I'm talking about this, I don't want to implicate my doctor in any sort of bad medical practice deal. He didn't know, and I wasn't honest, because I didn't want the drugs to stop flowing. And I thought, my God, I have cancer. I deserve this, And I was getting this roxicodone in these big tanks for two-week prescriptions. They'd come in 2 tanks, and that was my main painkiller, and I'd inject that into my feeding tube. Then I was also receiving healthy doses of Ativan, which is for anti-anxiety. And then because we couldn't quite get my pain management down, we also added a drug called fentanyl. and fentanyl was the drug that Prince recently OD'd on. And I was getting these in the form of patches, and I was patching them all over my body. I would not all at once, but I would put one on and go through a few days, put another one on, leave the old one on just in case there was another charge there. There was some more left over. So eventually I would be running around with all these different fentanyl patches on me. And on top of that, I was also drinking, and I was injecting wine into my feeding tube. And the behavior because of that, of course, got worse. And I'm trying to think of the first incident, I fell at one point and injured my shoulder and had to be hospitalized for it. I also got into a car accident, and I passed out in a movie theater where the police had to call my wife to come and pick me up. And these kinds of incidents were happening more often and more often, and my friends once again were there for me. They came over and did an intervention. They talked me out of my car keys so that I was no longer driving around high. And I gave up my car keys, and not too long after that, I decided to check into a detox center. Partially because I had had a conversation with my doctor, and in a rare moment of honesty, I told him that I was an addict. And so part of me wanted to survive. I desperately wanted to survive. I was going through all the cancer treatments, and then the other part of me wanted to tear it all down with drug and alcohol use. And it seemed like through the entire time that I was going through this process, it was a battle. And so I went into the detox and got off the opioids, which is the one success story that I had there, and left. But that night, I stole 2 bottles of wine. I didn't steal it. I bought it from the hotel concierge and snuck upstairs and had them and got drunk. And the reason we were in a hotel was because it was my first night at the Cleveland Clinic, which is a world-renowned hospital up in Cleveland. My wife had found that they could do another operation that would restore my esophagus so that I could eat normally. It was wearing on me. It was very difficult and lonely being a person who couldn't go out to eat, couldn't have dinner with people, couldn't socialize normally. When I'd have to leave early because fluid was leaking out of my neck. When I'd have to wear scarves in the middle of summer, and so we were looking for some way that I could start to function normally. The other thing that was happening was that I had gone from 240 pounds at the beginning to 127 pounds. And so I was a walking skeleton. And I also had this habit or an addiction, or whatever you want to call it, I was so lacking in stimuli in terms of food that I would chew up the food in my mouth just to taste it, and then I'd have to stand over the toilet and have it gush out of the side of my neck. And and I did that day after day, and I was starving, but I was starving all the time because none of the nutrition was getting down into my body. And so I would occasionally do some of the nutrition through my food too, but mostly I was just there trying to feed this nameless hunger. And so we went to the Cleveland Clinic for about a year, and my drinking had increased to about 2 bottles of wine a day through the feeding tube. And that two bottles of wine a day was actually displacing the nutrition, so that I was getting thinner and thinner. And we were okayed for the operation. The operation took 14 hours, it was agonizing, and it was the hardest thing that I think I've ever gone through. And I mean, aside from the last 3 years, but this one, this like typical, this point was really the hardest thing. And when I got back home, though, I had all this extensive surgery done. I had sutures up and down. My first thought was, how am I going to get a drink? I was no longer on opiates. I was taking 1 or 2 pills just for the pain, but it wasn't doing it for me. And I got up, got dressed, sutures and all, in utter pain. I had a missing part of my clavicle, or missing part of my clavicle and missing part of my sternum that they had taken out, and that's gone for good. And that was kind of grinding bone against bone while I was on my bike, and I drove my bike up to the UDF and I bought wine, and that was the first kickoff for that. And my drinking increased to another 3 or 4 bottles a day, and soon after, as if there weren't enough things going on, I was diagnosed. The cancer had metastasized to my lungs, and so I was put on a chemo regimen and a radiation regimen. And those were the hardest regimens I'd ever been on. It took, I can't remember, 6 or 9 months of chemotherapy, and the doctor had told me that I could quit whenever I wanted, but that he wanted me to get to a certain point. So it was this horrible open-ended, like, make it as long as you can, and we'll see how it goes from there. And my volatility, my emotional volatility, and self-pity and anger were coming out as my drinking grew more. And my wife had it at that point. And so I moved out. I moved in with my 72-year-old mom. We watched a lot of Fox News together. But beyond that, there wasn't much I could do. I would get my weekly chemotherapy treatments and watch TV, and during that time, I really started to want to not drink anymore. I wanted to get off of this, and I don't know about the timing. I don't know why I wouldn't have wanted to stop drinking like when I first was diagnosed. I don't know why it had to happen now, but I started to want to stop drinking, and I was going to AA meetings drunk. I was going to therapy groups drunk. I was going to, I had two additional therapists that I saw. So I had all these ways of trying to cope with this and try to get rid of this, and it just, nothing clicked, nothing happened. I would make promises to myself, yes, this is going to be it, this is going to be it, but the next day I would go to the mini market and once again buy a few bottles of alcohol. I'd get up at 4 in the morning in shaking in terror, and drive to the mini market, wait until it opened, wait until they were allowed to sell alcohol, and buy all the alcohol that I could, and sneak it home before my wife woke up, drink as much of it as I could without gagging, and start the whole process all over again. And then came the one day where I was laying down in bed and I was too malnourished to get up, and I wet myself. And that, for some reason, was what kicked off this willingness. It was a willingness that I never had, and that was, I want to go to detox and I want to quit drinking. And so I went to detox and I did quit drinking, and I was, I can't explain why it happened after all those horrendous things had happened to me, except that something in me, some sort of cycle of pleasure or pain, some cycle had just burnt out of me, and I was tired of it. And that was about 8 months ago, and my cancer was officially in remission, I guess about in May. So I'm glad to be alive. Thank you. Evan Carroll, ladies and gentlemen.